Welcome everyone to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. Tonight we're going to be talking about a theological puzzle, and it tries to figure out how these two pieces fit together. How do we fit together God's perfect foreknowledge, and how is that compatible with our being free or human freedom? My guest is Dr. Taylor Cyr. I believe I'm saying your last name correctly. I'll bring him in now. So, Dr. Cyr, do you want to go ahead and just give us a little bit of your background, how you got into philosophy, and maybe any work you've done on this topic?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks, Jordan, for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun, I think. I got interested in philosophy coming at it from Christian theology. So like a lot of Christians probably that grow up in the church, I started thinking about what I believe more seriously in high school and then, of course, into college. And I was thinking about studying theology at the postgraduate level, seminary, maybe a PhD. Kind of always thought I would end up doing academic work. But as I started taking philosophy classes, thinking this would help me prepare for studying theology, I would, learn to think more critically, to argue well, that sort of thing. I sort of got hooked by the puzzles in philosophy. So especially free will, other issues in philosophy of religion. As I started my PhD at the University of California, Riverside, I got interested in time travel and philosophy of time more generally. Also, questions about whether death can be bad, whether immortality would be a desirable thing. So all these puzzles just grew with me, and I sort of got stuck doing philosophy and not going on to study theology more formally. But I have retained my interest in theology and work at the intersection of philosophy and theology to some degree. So I teach now at Stanford University, assistant professor of philosophy here. And since I've been coming here, I've been working a little bit more on free will and divine foreknowledge. So maybe I've been working on critiquing some alternative views to my own. But before I don't want to tell you all of my views or what other views criticize before we talk about them tonight. But I am working on a few papers on these topics.
Great. All right. Well, I'm really fortunate to have you lay out some of this before those papers come out. I feel like I'm getting a sneak peek. All right. So you're going to lay out a very precise formulation of this puzzle, we're calling it. But before we do that, we want to define a few terms, and these are going to be very important to actually really, I think, grasp the puzzle. If these aren't clearly laid out, people may not feel the force of it, but I want people to feel the force. Okay, so the very first relevant term is God. So when we are speaking of God, what are we meaning by that?
Right. So I'm not going to give you a full definition of God, but for our purposes, what matters is that God, as Christians and in other traditions, well, God is traditionally taken to be, God is eternal, and he's existed from eternity, you might say. Sometimes we use that language. And he's essentially omniscient. So I'll say a little bit more about that, I guess, in just a minute. But I mean, the rough and ready idea is that God knows everything there is to know. So presumably there are truths about how you and I will act in the future. If that's true, then God, if he's essentially omniscient, he's going to know how we'll act in the future. And so that's sort of what gives rise to the puzzle is that, these two things seem to be in tension with each other, that God knows what we're going to do in advance and also that we're free in some sense. So, yeah, so I guess all I really need to say about God is that, for the purposes of this argument, is that he's eternal and essentially omniscient. But I haven't really told you what either of those things mean, so I guess I should
go ahead and lay out eternity and then essential omniscience.
Yeah. There are sort of two ways to take the claim that God's eternal. One is to say that God is in time and he exists at all times. So this is sometimes called the sempiternal view, sempiternity. God is in time, he's a temporal God in that way, but he has no beginning and no end, so he's existed from eternity, he's never going to go out of existence. So that's one way of understanding eternity, and that's probably the view that we'll sort of presuppose throughout most of this conversation. But there is another view, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, that says that God's outside of time. So this is the timeless view of God, or the atemporal view of God.
Mm-hmm.
So you might think that's actually going to help with the puzzle. We'll see one view appeals to God's being outside of time to try to help. But a lot of Christians, certainly a lot of Christian philosophers nowadays, think of God as being in time. And if he's in time, this is going to give rise to a puzzle about how we could have free will. Okay, so that's eternity. And then the other aspect of God that we need to flesh out more is the idea of his being essentially omniscient. So to say that God's omniscient, I gave a kind of rough understanding of that a minute ago, but he's got no false beliefs. And typically people think he's got comprehensive knowledge. So he knows every true fact. He knows every true proposition. So this traditionally is taken to include facts, true propositions about the future. So if God's omniscient, he doesn't have any false beliefs, but it's not enough to just say that God sort of happens to be right all the time, right? The idea of his being essentially omniscient is to say he sort of can't go wrong. He's infallible in a certain sense. So any being that has at least one false belief, that's not God. It's essential to God that he's omniscient in the sense that he has no false beliefs, and he knows all the true propositions.
Yeah. Okay. So that defines the relevant terms for us. So there's one more, though, and that is free will. So
Right.
Go ahead and lay out, and this is a big topic, so...
And this is another one where we'll probably, at least one of the views that we'll talk about, people could disagree about the conception of free will that we'll start with. But, when you start thinking about what it means to have free will, a natural thought that comes into people's minds is this idea of being able to choose or select from more than one course of option that's genuinely available to you. So think of it like this, to use the metaphor of the garden of forking paths. You're walking through a garden and you come to a fork in the path, and you can choose to go to the left or you can choose to go to the right. And it's sort of up to you which way you go. For decisions that are more significant in your life, think about decisions about whether to be in a relationship with someone or deciding where to go to college, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like having free will with respect to those decisions means having alternative possibilities, or what we might call leeway, having these various courses of action that are sort of open to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like I said, not everyone's going to buy into that conception of free will, but that idea that freedom involves the ability to do otherwise, or the freedom to do otherwise, that's going to be at the heart of the argument.
Okay. All right. Then and you had a little note here, but I don't know if you already mentioned that or not. Did you want to say anything about that note?
Before we get into the argument, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. I sent you what you're going to put up on the slide, this sort of more formal, simplified but formal version of the puzzle or the argument for divine foreknowledge and human free will being incompatible. But the basic idea, the reason that there's a tension between these things is really simple. So I don't want people to get lost in the details or formalities. I mean, really the idea that God is infallible and the idea that the past is fixed, that we don't have any control over what the past is like. It's those two things that are going to sort of drive the argument to show that if God exists and he had comprehensive foreknowledge in the past, well, then we're not free to do otherwise. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say before you show the argument.
I'm going to put up the main argument now. And Dr. Cyr was creative. He made it relevant to you, the viewers. So this argument has you, the viewers, in it. Okay,
that's not original to me. Almost everyone that presents this argument makes it about you reading this paper or buying this book or something similar. Yeah.
So I've put the main argument on the screen so they can see it. Do you want to state each premise and then you can defend those premises if you want.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll have to say a little bit more about the terminology in the argument in a minute, but let's make sure we've read them all first. So the first premise is that you have no choice about this fact, namely that God believed 1,000 years ago that you would watch this video today. So again, if we're supposing that God exists and is eternal in the sense of existing at all times, and also essentially omniscient, then if you're watching this video right now, whether you're watching it live or not, right, God was there 1,000 years ago, long before you were born, believing that you would watch this video at this precise time. Okay, so that's so the first premise says, well, you don't have any choice about that fact, that God believed that proposition 1,000 years ago, that you would watch this video today. Okay, more about that in a minute. And then the second premise says, necessarily, if God believed 1,000 years ago that you would watch this video today, then you watch this video today. And the idea here is, look, if God is essentially omniscient, there's a necessary connection between his believing that you'll do something and you're actually doing it. So if God believed 1,000 years ago that you're going to watch this video now, well, then you're going to watch this video now because, well, if you didn't, God would have had a false belief, and so it wouldn't have been God. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the second. And then the conclusion is just that you have no choice about watching this video today. Which is to say, you couldn't do otherwise. You're not free with respect to watching this video now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was the main argument. Now, you said that you wanted to kind of identify a couple of more things within the argument before we start analyzing it.
That's right. So I've sort of hinted at this, but this claim, or this, I guess it's this expression about having a choice about, it's very common in discussions of free will, both about divine foreknowledge and about other issues that we may or may not get into. But in any case, this idea of having a choice about is roughly equivalent. Some people might disagree with this, but it's roughly equivalent to having the ability or freedom to do otherwise. So if you have no choice about something that you do, well, then you weren't free to refrain from doing that thing. You didn't have any alternative course of action available to you. So claims 1 and 3, the first premise and the conclusion, both refer to what you have a choice about, what you don't have a choice about. And that's referring to free will in the sense of the garden of forking paths, or this leeway conception of freedom. Okay, and then the other thing is, yeah, I made it specific to your watching this video today, but presumably there's nothing special about your watching this video right now. If God has knowledge of that, he's going to have knowledge of any other action that you might perform. And so the argument's going to generalize to all cases of human action. So even though it's specifically about this action of your watching this video now, right, we can easily see that it will generalize to all of our actions. And thus, it looks like if God knows what we're going to do in advance, then we're not free to do otherwise with respect to any of our actions.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I've already got some people in the comments here trying to critique the argument. SlamRN said no doesn't make us no as in knowledge doesn't make us do it. So and then good. John DeRosa said necessary operator is only in premise 2. Conclusion may not follow. So already the gears are turning. Thank you. I'm glad that you're thinking about it. So we're going to start analyzing the argument, starting with the question, is it valid? So walk us through that. You can define what valid is. And
so a valid argument is an argument where if the premises are true, then the conclusion is going to be true too. An invalid argument is an argument that isn't valid. So the conclusion wouldn't follow from the premises. Now, it sounds like from one of those comments that at least one person thinks it's not a valid argument because we've got a necessity operator on claim 2, but not in claim 1 or claim 3. And so it looks like, why would we think that the conclusion would follow from these other 2 claims, right? So if you think it's an invalid argument, then you think that it doesn't follow from, this is going to get a little bit complicated, but stay with me. It doesn't follow from you're not having a choice about X and X necessarily leading to Y, that then you're gonna, if you think the argument's invalid, then you think, well, you could still have a choice about Y, even though you didn't have a choice about X, and X necessarily leads to Y. Or maybe it leads to is suggestive, but there's a necessary connection between X and Y. So there is an inference. There is a sort of inference rule that we're relying on here. This idea that you don't have a choice about what necessarily follows from something else you don't have a choice about. A lot of people think that's a pretty good, maybe even a sound inference rule. So there's not going to be any counterexamples to it. But you could disagree with the argument by rejecting the validity of the argument, by saying there's something problematic about that inference. None of the views that we're going to look at, none of the main responses to the argument deny that version of the inference rule. So suppose you do think there's a problem here with that kind of inference. There are ways around this exact formulation of the puzzle that get around it. So you can state some of the premises in a sort of conditional form that gets around relying on this transfer principle, this inference rule.
Okay.
So if people are interested, they can get in touch with me, and I can point them to some further reading and some other ways of presenting the argument. But this way, and I should have mentioned earlier, this exact formulation comes from the introduction to a volume on freedom, fatalism, and foreknowledge by John Martin Fisher and Patrick Todd. This is sort of the simplest, easiest way to see the puzzle, and so that's why I went with that. But there are ways of kind of beefing it up.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, if we kind of set that necessary operator idea, we can cash the argument out in a different way that that doesn't necessarily pose a problem. So then it seems like, yes, the argument would at least be valid in the sense that the conclusion would follow from the premises, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So then the question is there good support for the premises? Are those likely to be true? So we can start with the first premise. What do you think? Is there good support for it?
Right. So again, the first premise says that you don't have a choice about the fact that God believed 1,000 years ago that you'd be watching this video today. The main reason for thinking that is what's sometimes called fixity of the past. And I already hinted at that. The idea is, look, if God had this belief 1,000 years ago, then no matter what you do right now, right, you can't change the fact that God had that belief, right? There's no way that you have control over the past, right? Another way of putting it is the fixity of the past says your freedom is a freedom to add to the given past. So if you're talking about making a choice now, well then if you're making choice B rather than choice A would require the distant past 1,000 years ago to have been different, well, you can't make that choice, right? You can't. The past is a certain way, and it's sort of fixed for you. You have no control over it. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it would get in. Yeah. I'll just chime in one thought, and you can say, no, that's completely irrelevant if it's irrelevant. It reminds me of backward causation. Right. So, yeah, it's something that I do now can actually cause something to be different in the past. And if my understanding is right, if you were to grant backwards causation quickly, maybe absurdities, lots of problems seem to crop up. So
there are people who think that backward causation is incoherent or at least impossible.
Yeah.
I actually, so we'll get into this when we talk about one of the responses to the argument. I tend to think maybe backward causation is possible. Maybe I've watched too many time travel movies, and I think you can make sense of backward time travel, but I don't think there's anything incoherent about that. The proponent of the fixity of the past will say, even if you can do something now that will have sort of causal effects in the past, right? Those effects are back there in the past, and so you can't do anything that would require the past to have been different, even if you can do something now that would have an effect in the past. Or another way of putting it is that you can't change the past. That's a little bit too unfriendly to certain views in this debate. But in any case, you can't change the past. And if you buy into the fixity of the past, you should say you can't even do anything now that would require the past to have been different.
Okay. So what about the second premise then? that God's it has to do with God's essential omniscience.
Yeah, so this one's a little bit easier, I think, because given what we said about God's essential omniscience, really his infallibility, right? The idea is it's just going to necessarily follow from God's believing that X will occur, that X occurs. So if you give up that premise, you're giving up this conception of God's infallibility or his essential omniscience. So I don't think any of the views that we'll talk about give up that premise. There's just going to be different ways of objecting to the first premise or different ways of accepting the argument.
Okay. So we're going to start considering some responses, but I'll mention this funny comment. I had 22 viewers a few minutes ago, and then we laid out your argument, and then I dropped to 21. I can only assume that somebody thought, I'm going to prove them wrong and stop watching this video. But SlamRN actually said, she's watching, she said, I tried to turn off this video, but I couldn't. So thanks for sticking around, SlamRN. It looks like Andrew Moon is going to revise the main argument slightly to make it very valid, so that maybe there's not too many concerns that people have for its validity.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and start considering some responses while he's doing that. Now, you mentioned that there are some confused responses. So before we actually lay out the legitimate ones, or ones, that are relevant to the argument, there are some that we shouldn't appeal to, or they're not really relevant. So the first one you mentioned was human foreknowledge doesn't take away freedom. So why would divine foreknowledge? So explain this a little.
Yeah, so a lot of people, when they hear this argument, and I think one of those earlier comments that you read was getting at this idea. It's very intuitive that, look, if you know that someone's going to do something, it doesn't follow that you're forcing them or causing them or in any way kind of constraining them, making them do the thing. So why would it be that God's knowing something would be constraining or coercive or something like that? Okay, so let's compare a case of human foreknowledge with the case of divine foreknowledge and see what the difference is. So suppose you told a friend yesterday that you're going to be watching this video now, and suppose that you're pretty trustworthy, and suppose that your friend believes you, maybe that whatever you think it takes for your friend to count as knowing that you're going to watch this video today. If you think anyone can know what any other human being is going to do, right, your friend knows that you're going to watch this video today. Okay, so that's a case of human foreknowledge. I think there can be such cases, right? And yet I think that this is a confused response, but this part is right. Just because some other human being knows that I'm going to do something, that kind of it doesn't mean that I'm not free to do otherwise. Okay, what's the difference between the human case and the divine case? Well, you can put it really succinctly like this. Well, humans aren't essentially omniscient, right? It's not essential to them that they never have any false beliefs. It's completely possible that your friend knows that you're going to watch this video now, and yet you are free, in some sense, to refrain from watching this video because, what would it take? What would the world have to look like for you to prove your friend wrong? Well, they would have just had a false belief, but your friend would still exist, right? It's not part of their essential nature that they don't have any false beliefs. But what would the world have to be like in order for you to do otherwise than what God knew you were going to do? Well, God would have to have a false belief, in which case God wouldn't be God, right? So you'd have this ability to make God not exist or something like that, something impossible, right? Something that's clearly possible in the human case, making it so that this human being has a false belief, not possible in the divine case because, well, God's essentially omniscient. So there's something to this idea that the mere knowledge that something's going to happen doesn't make it necessary or inevitable for that person. But in the divine case, because of God's essential omniscience, it looks like we can generate this problem that can take away freedom in some way. Yeah.
Very good. Okay. That was clear. So
good.
That's one. So SlamRN, you feel free to, she was the one that mentioned it previously. Feel free to ask a question at the at the end, I'll make sure I tell you, and I can put it up on the screen so that we can look at it. But that's one type of response, but it's not really like you explained there. It can work for the human side of things, but right. When we try to make God analogous to human in that sense, it's a very different, because he has this essential. He can't have a false belief like we can.
Right.
Okay, so then the second one is Molinism. The second type of confused response that you mentioned is Molinism. So explain this briefly.
So I know you've done a couple of videos on Molinism already, so maybe some of your followers will like Molinism. I'm not going to bash Molinism or anything, or tell you that you can't be a Molinist. I do think there are some challenges for Molinism, but the basic idea, well, for our purposes, right, a sort of key claim that Molinists make is that God has middle knowledge, and so sort of in between God's natural knowledge, his knowledge of necessary truths, and his free knowledge, his knowledge of the world that he's decided to create, his own creative will. There's this middle knowledge that's knowledge of what sometimes people call counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, CCFs, where what God knows is how every possible creature would freely act in all possible circumstances. So God has access to all of these counterfactuals, or these subjunctive conditionals, about how all of these possible creatures would freely act. And he can use that knowledge, the Molinist says, to actualize a world that he has more providential control over than he would if he didn't have middle knowledge. Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, it's a claim about the nature of God's knowledge and about how he can exert a certain kind of providence over his creation.
Yeah.
But some people think that Molinism itself is a sort of response to this puzzle about foreknowledge and freedom. But notice that everything I just said about middle knowledge just presupposes that human beings have the freedom to do otherwise. I said how creatures would freely act in all these possible circumstances. It sort of presupposes that's compatible with God knowing exactly how they will act. There's nothing about Molinism that gives you a reason to reject premise 1 or premise 2, or even the inference, the transfer principle that the argument relies on. Mm-hmm. So it's important to keep clear, you can be a Molinist and think that divine foreknowledge and free will are compatible. In fact, you have to. That's sort of presupposed by Molinism. But you need some response to this argument if you want to take it seriously anyway. So you'll have to rely on one of the responses that we'll talk about, or some other response. But it's sort of not part of Molinism that there's a solution to this puzzle.
Yeah, that's interesting. I might save some questions on that for the end when we're doing, because I had some in mind. But like you said, if you look at, just for people to see it again, if you put the main argument back on the screen, so you're saying, the Molinist, there's nothing inherent to Molinism that would cause or that would lead you to reject premise 1 or premise 2. Right. So then the conclusion would still follow, so we still have a puzzle on our hands.
Right.
Okay.
So you'd have to say a little, even if you're a Molinist and you have this view of providence and sort of the nature of God's knowledge, you have to say a little bit more about why God's having this knowledge sort of in our world, in the actual world that God's created. Why he had this knowledge 1,000 years ago doesn't take away my freedom right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, then let's begin discussing the relevant responses that are going to take issue with that main argument in one form or another. Mm-hmm. So you helpfully, when you put your notes together for me, kind of laid out two types of responses. So I'm going to put on the screen kind of the two main categories, and we're going to walk through each one of these in particular. So do you want to explain broadly what the two kinds of responses are?
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. So you can say that the argument has gone wrong in one way or another and maintain that divine foreknowledge and human free will are in fact compatible. So these are compatibilist responses to the argument. We're going to talk about three versions of compatibilist responses: timelessness, Ockhamism, and dependence. And then another option is to say, well, this argument is very good. Maybe it's sound. In any case, if God foreknows what we're going to do, and we lack the freedom to do otherwise, these are sometimes called incompatibilist responses. And so the two that we'll look at are open theism and semi-compatibilism.
Very good.
Maybe it's worth mentioning very quickly, in case people have read something on or heard something on free will before, the terms compatibilist and incompatibilist, and this might be occurring to some people, especially since I've mentioned Molinism, libertarianism about free will. These terms are often, maybe mainly, employed in debates about whether causal determinism and free will are compatible or not.
Right.
So we just have to be clear, we're talking about divine foreknowledge for now. There might be some interesting connections between these debates, but you can be a compatibilist about foreknowledge and freedom and incompatibilist about causal determinism and freedom. In fact, that's what a Molinist is. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so hopefully that's clear when we're using that term compatible or incompatible. We're talking about this divine foreknowledge and human freedom, which is the title of the video. So hopefully people pick that up. Okay, all right, so the first response falls in that. So we're going to look at just the category of compatibilism for now. And the first type was this timelessness response. So can you explain how this timelessness response works?
Yes. Yeah, so going back to especially Boethius and St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas, other classical theists from the medieval period and slightly earlier, these theologian philosophers have given up this, or they've rejected the idea that God exists in time. So their view of God is that God is timeless, hence the name of the view, the timelessness response. He's outside of time. We could put a slightly finer point on that, although I don't want this to detain us too much. The idea is that God possesses all of his life all at once. He doesn't exist by persisting from moment to moment, through duration, duration through succession, one moment after the next. There's nothing incomplete or imperfect about God. So for us, finite beings, we experience the past and then the present and then the future, one moment after the next. God has his whole life all at once. He doesn't have to wait for the future to come around to experience it. He's got it all at once. So sometimes people use this terminology of his timeless present because he exists in this so-called moment outside of time, but it's got to be atemporal or timeless. This timeless present. Okay, so if we don't take God's eternity to be sempiternity, if we don't take God to be existing at all times, right? Here we get a sort of quick response to the argument. It's false that God believed 1,000 years ago anything, because God didn't exist 1,000 years ago. He exists timelessly, or he exists outside of time. And so strictly speaking, he doesn't have beliefs at times. So how is that supposed to be a response to the argument? Well, the first premise of the argument is going to come out as false, because it says you have no choice about this thing that God believed 1,000 years ago, that you'd watch this video today. That's sort of irrelevant to our freedom, because it's just not the case that God had any beliefs 1,000 years ago.
Okay, so that's a clear kind of rejection of premise one. Right. Now, do you have any kind of evaluation of that kind of response? What do you think?
Right. So I like the view that God's timeless. I think I'm a full-fledged classical theist myself, like Boethius and Aquinas and others. But in any case, I do think God's outside of time. And so, but I don't think that this response is going to sort of undermine the argument, or fully solve the puzzle, I should say. It might undermine the version of the argument that we've looked at, but there's a way of slightly tweaking a couple of the claims that the argument makes and running a parallel argument against the compatibility of God's timeless knowledge of what we do, and are having freedom with respect to what we do. So I don't think you made a slide for this one, but it's very similar to the original argument. In place of premise 1, here's what you have no choice about. God timelessly believes that you watch this video today. And then claim 2, slightly modified, necessarily if God timelessly believes that you watch this video today, then you watch this video today, right? If you think God's essentially omniscient, then even if he has his beliefs outside of times, he timelessly knows what you're going to do. There's a necessary connection between that and you're doing what you do. So same conclusion, you have no choice about watching this video today. So it seems like even if God's outside of time, there's still this puzzle. How could we be free with respect to anything that we do if God has comprehensive knowledge, not foreknowledge, but timeless knowledge of what we'll do?
Okay.
So it looks like it just sort of, I don't know, it technically solves the first version of the problem, but the problem is still there for the timeless view.
Yeah, so hopefully, and I think you did an excellent job of laying that out. I'm sorry I don't have a slide with the modified version, but essentially you just reformulated the main argument and just put it in terms of God being timeless. Right. And then it looks like the same exact conclusion follows. So it doesn't seem like the timelessness response is really going to solve the deep puzzle. Maybe it answers that first argument, but it just raises the next form. So do you want to move on to the next response, or do you have anything else to say about timelessness?
If we have just a minute, maybe I'll say one thing on behalf of the timelessness response, and that's that the original argument, I mentioned that one of the sort of the engine driving the argument really is the fixity of the past. So there's this idea that we can't do anything that would require the past to be different. So if you're acting otherwise would require God to have a different belief in the past, then you can't do that. You're not free. Because the modified argument that I just presented doesn't make reference to the past, it has to employ a different sort of fixity principle. So instead of saying that the past is fixed and that's why you can't do otherwise, it says that this timeless or atemporal realm is fixed. So God's timelessly believing something, that's something you don't have a choice about. Mm-hmm. That's the modified first premise. And you might think, well, that's just not as plausible as the claim that the past is fixed, right? It might be that there's more reason to think the timeless realm is something that's under our control in some sense, or that we can affect it in a way that, or we can act such that the timeless realm would have been different, even though we can't act such that the past would have been different. So there are some things to say here. I'm not fully moved by that. I think, so Linda Zagzebski is a philosopher who's written a lot on freedom and foreknowledge. In fact, if you're interested in reading more about this, a good place to start is her online free Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on freedom and foreknowledge. She thinks that this the sort of fixity of the timeless realm is just as intuitive as the fixity of the past. I think it's at least somewhat intuitive. So I don't know if it's quite as intuitive as the principle of the fixity of the past, but it's close. So there's more work to be done there to explore exactly whether this is going to evade the problem.
Mm. Okay, very good. So that gives the viewers something to go to look deeper. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that entry on this problem by what was the name?
Her name's Linda Zagzebski.
Okay, very good. All right, let's look at this next type of compatibilist response, Ockamism.
Yeah, good. So this one has been one of maybe the most popular, at least since the puzzle of freedom and foreknowledge sort of re-entered the contemporary debate in the 1960s and 70s. So from about the 60s to, I don't know, the late 90s at least, and a little bit beyond into this century, the Ockamism was sort of the main view among Christian philosophers, the main way to respond to the argument. I'm going to hope to convince you that it's sort of not going to work, and that there's a reason that people have sort of moved on from it in the last decade or so. But anyway, it's named after William of Ockham, who was a late medieval Christian theologian, philosopher. And really key to the Ockhamist solution is a distinction between two types of facts about the past. So he distinguished between hard facts about the past and soft facts about the past. Okay, so hard facts about the past are facts that are entirely about some past time. So an example of this is that Occam was born in 1285. That's a fact about 1285, and it's all about 1285. There's nothing about the future relative to 1285 that fact sort of contains. Now, soft facts about the past, by contrast, are temporally relational. They're not all about the time in question. So hopefully I did the math right when I was typing out these notes. Occam was born in 1285, 735 years before our having this conversation in 2020. So it looks like a fact about the past that Occam was born in 1285, but by adding this little clause to the end that was exactly 735 years before our having this conversation, that makes it sort of sneaks in some information about the future relative to 1285. So it's not genuinely about the past, or at least it's not all about the past. So we could say this is a fact about 1285, but it's soft in the sense that it is temporally relational and across times.
Okay.
Yeah. So why make this distinction between two types of facts about the past? Well, the idea in the Ockhamist solution is to say there are some facts about the past that we can't do anything about now. They're sort of outside of our control. They're fixed for us. There's nothing we can do to affect those parts of the past. But there are other facts about the past, these soft facts about the past, that aren't fixed, that don't constrain our freedom. Okay, so what the Ockhamist wants to do is say this idea that the past is fixed, it only makes sense if you have in mind the hard past, or the hard facts about the past. So the fact that Occam was born in 1285, that's a hard fact about 1285. There's nothing that I can do here in 2020 such that Occam was not born in 1285. However, this soft fact about 1285, that Occam was born then 735 years before our having this conversation, well, maybe that's not something that's fixed for me. Maybe if I had decided to bail on our conversation, that fact wouldn't have been a fact. Occam still would have been born in 1285, but he wouldn't have been born then exactly 735 years before our having this conversation, because we wouldn't have had this conversation. So it looks like, at least if we can figure out a way to draw this distinction between hard and soft facts in a plausible way, it looks like we should restrict the fixity of the past, the stuff that's outside of our control, to the stuff that's really about the past and not also kind of about what we're doing now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So then tell me what part of the main argument this kind of response would apply to.
Right. Yeah, I haven't even given you all of Ockamism yet, because so far, many other people could agree with what we've said about this distinction between different types of facts about the past. But the Ockhamist move in response to this puzzle of freedom and foreknowledge is to categorize God's beliefs in a way that you might not think so natural. The idea is that God's beliefs are going to count as soft facts about the past and not hard facts about the past. So if you look at the first premise again, you have no choice about the fact that God believed 1,000 years ago that you'd watch this video today. That belief of God's, that fact that God believed that thing 1,000 years ago, the Ockhamist is going to say, that's actually not entirely about the past. It's also partly about what you're doing now. And so it's going to count as a soft fact about the past. And so we shouldn't hold it fixed. The fact that God believed 1,000 years ago that you'd watch this video today. Actually, that's a soft fact about the past. So premise one actually turns out to be false. You do have a choice about what God believed 1,000 years ago, because his believing what he did is soft in that sense.
Okay, I see. But I think you have some objections to Ockhamism, so lay those out.
Right. So the first thing to say is that one of the reasons that Ockamism got a lot of traction, and there were a lot of articles published on it from the 60s into the 90s, is that there was the puzzle of trying to figure out exactly how to spell out the difference between hard and soft facts about the past. So article after article came out where people would offer a new account of this distinction, and someone else would refute it, and then someone would tinker with it, publish another article. So that happened for many years. But the sort of main category that all of these different proposals sort of fell into was they were trying to give an account of soft facts that made reference to entailment. So if something entails something else, then the second thing can't be false without the first thing being false, right? If the first thing's true, then the second thing's going to be true too. And so that might sound to you already like how I described God's believing something, right? If God's essentially omniscient, then his believing that X will occur, that entails that that thing will occur because of this necessary connection between what God believes and what happens, given his essential omniscience.
Right.
So the main way of trying to spell out what it is for something to be a soft fact about the past is by reference to entailment. If some fact about the past entails something about the future relative to that time, well, then it's soft. So, this example I gave of Occam being born in 1285, 735 years before our having this conversation, that entails that we have this conversation 735 years after Occam was born. So that would count as soft by this entailment criterion of soft facts. Mm-hmm. But there are problems with that entailment view. Here's one. Every fact about a time entails something about the future relative to that time. So suppose that the thing in question is some events happening, like Occam being born. Well, that entails that he wasn't born for the first time a year later or 2 years later. It's going to entail all sorts of facts about the future relative to that original time.
Right.
Even if there's some way around that, it looks like entailment's just not the right kind of you might say dependence of God's beliefs on our actions to capture this idea that his beliefs are under our control. So to use an example from Patrick Todd, right? If God in the past decreed, right, he gives out this infallible decree that we'll have this conversation now. Well, that entails that we're going to have this conversation now. He's decreed it. Maybe he's determined that it'll happen. It's impossible. Maybe it's physically impossible for it not to happen, given God's decree. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't want to say God's decree is soft facts that we have some control over, just because it entails that we're going to have this conversation. So it looks like entailment is just not the right way to capture this idea of something, at the very least of it being under our control, is that this action's entailed by something about the past. Okay. And so that's one main problem. Do we have time that I could go into one other? Because I think it'll nicely segue into the
I'm really trying to destroy Phil with Skill's hopes. He said I like Ockamism, so I'm a little salty. I'm just kidding, Phil with Skill. I'm not trying to destroy you here, but go ahead and I think we've got time. So
okay, yeah. Here's the other thing. Whereas this fact that Occam was born a certain number of years before having this conversation, that's obviously temporally relational. Some person or some beings having a belief in the past, just having a certain mental state, right? Like there's some kind of representation of the future happening, but that representation, that being in that mental state, looks like it's just as much about the past as Occam being born at a certain time in the past. So it looks like God's belief shouldn't be categorized as soft. It looks like, if anything is going to count as a hard fact about the past, someone, including God's, having a certain belief in the past, that should count as back there in the past, something that isn't temporally relational, just having the belief, that is. Right. Of course, if you say, I have a true belief about what will happen in the future, well, then it might depend on what happens in the future. You might think it's soft because, right, we're talking about this claim being true, but just making a claim, like imagine making a prediction about the future, right? The prediction itself is all in the past. Its truth or falsity might depend on the future. Similarly, God's beliefs, truth or falsity, might depend on what happens in the future, but his having the belief, that's all about the past. Mm. So it looks like Ockamism is sort of getting off on the wrong track here to begin with, because it's treating God's beliefs as temporally relational, when that's not the right sort of thing. That's not the way to think about beliefs. So if I could read one quote, this is one of my favorite quotes from philosopher Peter Van Inwagen, who's written a lot on free will. He says, if some philosopher's definition or analysis of about the past, and he's talking about this distinction between hard and soft facts, has the consequence that the proposition that God believed in 1900 that I was going to lie at a certain moment is not about the past. That proposition constitutes a counterexample to that philosopher's definition. So yeah, the idea that God's belief is part of the past, just like other hard parts of the past, that seems very intuitive, and it seems like a mistaken view of what it is to have a belief, to treat it as temporally relational.
Okay, all that was really interesting. Okay, so the final compatibilist response, the dependence response.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead and give some background there.
Okay, yeah, so this response, I mean, it has a long history too, or at least one of the central claims that it makes goes back to at least Origen, Christian church father. Molina, after whom Molinism is named, made a similar claim about dependence, and many others. They've wanted to say something like this: God's beliefs about what we will do in the future depend on what we'll do in the future, not the other way around. It's not like what we do in the future depends on what God believes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
actually, we got some of the comments that said exactly that. Who was
good.
it? It was just a few comments ago. They say exactly that. So I'm glad that we're hitting on it.
Right. Yeah, good. So whereas at least the main defenses of Ockamism have appealed to this relatively weak kind of dependence, this entailment kind of dependence, where there's going to be a sort of entailment in both directions. When it comes to the dependence response, proponents of this view are going to invoke a stronger notion of dependence. Different theorists will work it out in different ways, but at the very least, right, there's this asymmetry. Right? God's beliefs depend on what we'll do rather than the other way around. That's the sort of key claim. We can make it a little bit more precise by distinguishing two claims that the dependence response wants to make, and then this will show why the first premise of the argument comes out false according to the dependence view. So the first claim is that it's a claim about what we're able to do, or about our freedom. So the idea is that any fact that is dependent on you're doing a certain action, right? Let's just call it X. Any fact that's dependent on your doing X shouldn't be held fixed. It shouldn't be. We shouldn't sort of keep it in mind when we're assessing whether you're free to do otherwise than X. Okay, so maybe we should have our toy example we've been using throughout the conversation, right? You're watching this video now, since that's for whoever's watching this video. That's something, an action you're doing. Okay, so if we're asking whether you're free to refrain from watching this video, then the dependence response says, don't hold fixed any fact that depends on what you're doing right now, watching this video or not. So, okay, that's the first part. And then the second part is how we get to the case of God's beliefs. The second claim is that God's past belief that you will watch this video now, or whatever action you have in mind, that depends in the appropriate way on you're actually doing the thing in question. You're actually watching this video. So basically the idea is, look, God's belief 1,000 years ago that you'd watch this video now, that depends on you're watching this video now. And so if you had refrained from watching this video, if you turned it off, you decided to do something else instead, well, then God would have had a different belief in the past 1,000 years ago. So this isn't, there is a way of trying to revise Ockamism that sort of uses dependence in this sense to fix what's broken about the entailment criterion of soft facts. But I think the natural way to think of the dependence view is to say that the past isn't really fixed. Even the hard past isn't really fixed. You can do something that would require God to have a different belief in the past. And the reason that's supposed to not be problematic, even though we usually think of the past being fixed, is that God's beliefs are dependent on what we do. Unlike other parts of the past, right? Typically we think that, Ockham's being born a certain year, that doesn't depend on what I do at all, right? But if God's beliefs are in this sort of different category, they depend on what we do, well, there's going to be something different about that part of the past. even though it's a hard part of the past, to use the Ockhamist language.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts there, but
Okay.
I don't want to slow. I'm going to save some of mine. It has to do with some of the Molinism thing, but I'm going to save that for the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess go ahead and take us from there. Finish out dependence, because we're gonna move on.
I guess, did I make it clear how? I mean, this view rejects the first premise of the argument, because the first premise says you don't have any choice about God's belief. But look, if God's belief depends on what you do, even though it's in the past, even though it's a hard bit of the past, to use the Ockhamist language, you have a choice about it even now. Okay, so that's how it's supposed to reject the first premise of the argument. Right. Sort of with the waning of Ockhamism in at least the philosophical, theological literature, this view has sort of gotten traction, especially in the last 10 years or so. So there's a lot of new work on this, cutting edge stuff coming out all the time. And this is some of the stuff that I'm working on now. Here's an objection. I think this is a tough objection, but not proponents of the dependence response will have to have something to say to this. Look, even though some parts of the past may be dependent on what we do, right? Take the case of God's beliefs. If God's beliefs really do depend on his beliefs 1,000 years ago, do depend on what we do, we might think even so, our freedom, if whatever freedom we have, is a freedom to add to the past as we've been born into it, right? The fact is we can't do anything about what was the case 1,000 years ago. So in other words, the intuitive idea that the past is fixed, that our freedom is to add to the given past, right? At least to all of the hard past, right? Set aside all that temporally relational stuff. So yeah, it seems like the past is fixed. That's a really intuitive idea, and yet the dependence response has to give that up, right? On this view, on the dependence view, right? Even though God has this belief 1,000 years ago that you'll watch this video now, you can do something that would require the past to have been different. And some people find that counterintuitive, but the proponent of the dependence response has to accept that. So I think it's sort of a departure from how we normally think about our powers, powers to add to the given past. But that's what the dependence response has to say. Now, it's not that the proponents of this response haven't said anything about this. In fact, there's a great paper by my friend Philip Swenson defending this dependence view. If anyone wants to check it out, it's in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Another friend of mine at University of California, Riverside, Andrew Law, just defended a dissertation developing this dependence review, defending it. And what people like Philip and Andrew want to do is say, there's something intuitive about the fixity of the past, but what's intuitive is that anything that's in the past that is sort of independent of what we do, that doesn't depend on our actions, that's what's fixed. But once we recognize that, this sort of core to this dependence view, right, if we admit that parts of the past are dependent, we should think, well, we could be free with respect to those parts of the past. So often, and this is where I love that my interest in time and time travel can come up when talking about free will, but you could motivate this kind of dependence review response, this view, by appealing to cases of time travel. Right? If you think that backward time travel is possible, right, it seems like whether you show up in the past is dependent on whether you press the button in the time machine or not here in the present. And so you might think you have some power over the past, that you're free even though you're doing otherwise than what you actually do would require the past to have been different. Mm-hmm. So I still think I still tend to think the fixity of the past is right, that this fixity of the independent past, but not the fixity of the past, that this isn't going to work. But that's where the debate is happening now, I should say.
Okay, interesting. All right, so then that finishes out the compatibilist responses. We looked at timelessness, Ockamism, and dependence. So now we're going to turn to the category of incompatibilist responses. So this would be some kind of denial either of God's perfect foreknowledge or of our human freedom. There's somehow you're going to have to give up one if they're incompatible.
Right.
Okay, so let's go ahead and start with open theism. Unless you
Okay,
had something
good.
to add before that.
No, that's perfect, and that's a nice way of sort of summarizing where we've been so far. Yeah, so open theism is the first route you mentioned, giving up the traditional view of God's comprehensive foreknowledge. So open theism is many things. It's a conception of God's nature. It's sort of an alternative to classical theism. It's a different account of providence than Molinism, say. But when it comes to responding to this puzzle, the freedom of foreknowledge puzzle, it's the view that gives up the traditional conception of divine foreknowledge, of comprehensive foreknowledge. So God, on this view, God is changeable. He's mutable, whereas classical theists want to deny that. But he's also lacking comprehensive foreknowledge. So he, for some reason or other, doesn't know everything about what will happen in the future. Yeah, so I guess this is the case for all the views that we're talking about, but whether someone is going to find this view attractive it's going to depend on their other theological and philosophical commitments. Maybe I'll mention a couple of those along the way, but this idea that God is mutable and that he doesn't have knowledge of everything that's going to happen in the future is not entirely sort of new or unprecedented. There's a really famous book from the 1990s developing this view. It's written by 4 or 5 authors. But in that book, there's sort of a case to be made for this being the biblical conception of God. Mm. So you might think there's a biblical case to be made for God being different than the God of classical theism. Christians disagree about that. In any case, that's a little bit about what open theism is, right? For our purposes, all that matters is that God doesn't have comprehensive foreknowledge of the future. Yeah. And so among the things that God doesn't know about the future are what beings will freely do. And so you just give up, if there's a dilemma or a tension here, you have to choose between divine foreknowledge of what we'll do and our freedom, right? Open theism sides with our freedom.
Okay. So then, I guess what premise are they going to target in this? Would it still be premise 1 that God knows this in the past? Is that the
right.
idea? Yeah,
I guess it is still premise 1. Yeah, because what they'll say is, if God were to know what you would do, 1,000 years before you did it, and he's essentially omniscient, he's infallible, then you would lack the freedom to do otherwise. And so we must say that God doesn't know.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not only that it's not like God had a belief about what you would do, and he just is wrong sometimes. It's that God just doesn't have. God's still not going to have false beliefs, presumably, on the open theist view. He's just going to lack knowledge of what will happen in the future. Mm-hmm. At least some of it. Yeah.
And so, I guess you can elaborate if you want. So obviously they're willing to give up God's omniscience, and I guess you can do that for philosophical reasons as well as biblical reasons. I can think of texts like God regretted such and such that he did. I think in the case of the flood, he regretted that he'd made mankind, and or God changed his mind.
Or repented.
Or God repented, right? So things like that can maybe motivate a view like this. Right. Is there any other, maybe more philosophical, just do they take freedom so they're so confident that they're free that they have to reject the view?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you might think free will, it's not only that we just value it so much, so we've got to do anything to protect it, but I mean, the idea that human beings have free will, this kind of leeway conception of free will I've been talking about, it's played a role in a lot of philosophy of religion. So the kind of main example is in response to the problem of evil, right? How could it be that God could create this world with all the suffering and other evil that's in our world if he's all powerful and he's all good and he's omniscient? One way to answer that, maybe it's not a full answer, but it could be part of the answer, is that our having free will, moral freedom, this kind of leeway we've been talking about, is a really great good. It's very valuable. And so God has good reason to create a world, even with all this evil in order to allow for our having free will, whether it's because morality is that important, our being, making moral choices is important, or maybe our being in a relationship with God, a loving relationship with God would require a certain kind of freedom. In any case, free will is pretty important. And if you think that none of the compatibilist responses that we've looked at are going to work, well, then that leaves you with saying either we don't have free will or we do, and we should take the open theist route. So there's that kind of motivation for it. You put it this way, that like it seems like they're willing to give up omniscience, that God knows everything. Some would be okay with saying that, I think, but probably most wouldn't. They'd want to say what it means to say God's omniscient is not the traditional view of omniscience. Right. Yeah. And that's
it reminds me of kind of Eugen Nagasawa's maximal God, in the sense of, look, we can't blame him for not knowing something that he can't know. He knows everything that you can know. And we're saying this is just something he can't know, so we're not giving anything up any more than it's giving up God's power that he can't make a square circle or something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's good to draw the analogy with omnipotence, right? Yeah, we shouldn't. Yeah, it's no complaint. It shouldn't be a complaint against God's omnipotence that he can't do the impossible, right? What's logically contradictory or something like that. Yeah, and so too, if God's knowing something about the future is impossible, or at least knowing it and it involving free will on the part of his creatures, if that's impossible, then yeah, it's no fault of him, or it's no mark against his omniscience.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So you asked about sort of philosophical motivation. There's sort of two competing philosophical versions of open theism. There's the terminology that sometimes gets used is open future open theism versus limited foreknowledge open theism. So open futurists think that there just aren't truths about the future, at least certain parts of the future, what's contingent. There aren't truths about the future to be known in the first place. And so, yeah, God literally couldn't have known what's going to happen, at least when it comes to the contingent future, including what we'll do, what you and I will do, because the future is open in a deep metaphysical sense. So if you have certain views in the philosophy of time about the openness of the future, you might be attracted to that sort of position. And then the other view says, well, there are truths to be known about the future, but for some reason God doesn't know them, right? I think that's been the more popular view because it's consistent with more views in the philosophy of time. You don't have to rely on this idea that the future is open. So I think Richard Swinburne, William Hasker, Peter Van Inwagen, who I mentioned earlier, they're all open theists of this stripe, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
And they'll disagree about why it is that God doesn't know these truths about the future. One plausible suggestion is in order for God to count as knowing something about the future, he's got to have good grounds for believing it. But if we really do have the freedom to do otherwise, then there's nothing determining what we'll do. And so maybe God doesn't have sufficient grounds for knowledge of what we'll do. So there is a puzzle. Even if you take one of the compatibilist routes we've looked at, there's this puzzle about how God could know the future. What's the mechanism of divine foreknowledge if he couldn't really just determine us to act in a certain way? Yeah.
There's a funny remark you may. I remember reading. It was one of William Lane Craig's questions of the week, and I think someone asked him, "How does God know? Like, what's the mechanism?" Yeah. And his reply made me laugh at the least. I thought it was a good reply, but you may not. It was, well, the analogy would be like, how does God have all this power? Does he do a bunch of bench presses every day to get all this power? And the idea is it's just essential to his very nature. That's just kind of the stopping point. It's just there's no further mechanism to explain how. I don't know. I thought it was just a funny little remark at the very least, but anyway, okay. Yeah.
And it's funny. It's not like God has to go and like read a bunch of textbooks or study or something, the equivalent of bench pressing to be omniscient. So, but there's still this worry of like, yeah, okay, I grant that it's part of God's essential nature that he's omnipotent. He has the power to do anything that's logically possible, whatever you think omnipotence is. But there's still this puzzle that if he's in time and the future, even if it's not like robustly open, we have the freedom to do otherwise. So that's contingent. it's on what basis is God going to believe things about the future? How is he going to be sort of justified in believing things about the future? Sometimes people appeal to this metaphor of like a time telescope. So like just like a telescope makes things further in space appear closer to you, maybe God has that, but for time. So he can just like look into the future and see without taking away the freedom or the contingency of what's going to happen. That's I don't know, that's a nice metaphor, but it doesn't really tell you about how that works or what the mechanism is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know that that's a terribly big problem. So yeah.
I don't know that we laid out the view on open theism, so they're going to accept human freedom and deny. Well, let me not rephrase it. They're going to, in some sense, God's omniscience on their conception is very different than the traditional. So they could, I guess, in a sense, they might want to say, "Look, we're compatibilist here." Well, I don't know, because they're denying foreknowledge and that. It depends on how you define your terms, but regardless,
that's a good reminder.
Yeah. Regardless, do you have any, maybe like the other views, how you had some potential objections? Do you have any to this kind of solution to the problem?
Yeah. Well, so if you think of theism as kind of being divided into these two parts, right? The open future and then the limited foreknowledge versions. There are going to be objections to each depending on which way you go. If you don't think that the future is open, so I think I'm an eternalist. We don't have to get into the philosophy of time too much, but I think there just are truths about the future, and so yeah, that would be a cost to give that up, to go for the open future view. If you take the other view, there's still this puzzle that we've just been talking about, how God could, what the mechanism is, why it would be that God would only know some things about the future, and not how he could not, why it is that he wouldn't know these truths about how we'll freely act. So those are sort of philosophical problems, but probably the reason that most, at least Christians, aren't attracted to open theism or wouldn't be comfortable taking this route is for theological reasons. Even though some people think that the sort of biblical data is in support of the open view of God, the vast majority of the Christian tradition has said, no, God is immutable, unchanging, and he's got comprehensive knowledge of everything that will happen. Even stronger, a lot of Christians have wanted to say God's in control of everything that's happening. He's got a stronger degree of providence than the open God can have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Since we're running short on time, we'll try to move quickly through semi-compatibilism, and then, if possible, try to sum up and start taking questions.
Okay.
We're at about the hour and 12 minutes. If we can take, like, within the next 15 minutes, kind of have our discussion wrapped up and start Q&A. That's the goal.
Okay. Yeah. I can go pretty quickly through semi-compatibilism. It's the right view, so it'll be easy to spell it out and defend it. I'm just kidding. I do defend semi-compatibilism. But here, the idea is we've been working with this conception of free will as involving the freedom to do otherwise, or leeway. But that's the wrong way to think about free will, some people think. Some people think what matters is that we are the source of our actions, that we're doing it freely, and that might not require our having the freedom to do otherwise than what we do. So that's what semi-compatibilists think. Semi-compatibilists think we can be free in the sense that matters for acting freely, even the sense that matters for us being morally responsible, accountable, liable for what we do, even if we don't have the freedom to do otherwise. Sometimes lacking the freedom to do otherwise can excuse us, or we can get off the hook. But just the mere fact of being of lacking alternative possibilities, that's not sufficient for lacking freedom and moral responsibility. So semi-compatibilists tend to focus on moral responsibility rather than freedom, because we can just sort of not worry about free will in this freedom to do otherwise sense, and we can just talk about the freedom required for moral responsibility. I won't say too much more about the view, but I do need to say at least this, that the way of motivating semi-compatibilism is by giving a kind of thought experiment, a case, a hypothetical scenario in which someone lacks the freedom to do otherwise, or the ability to do otherwise, and yet they nevertheless seem morally responsible. Right. And that's exactly what Harry Frankfurt, a contemporary semi-compatibilist, put forward in his classic 1969 paper, and there's been a whole literature talking about Frankfurt-style cases named after Harry Frankfurt, trying to see whether this kind of case can work. So here's the kind of case. I think actually in your last interview with Thomas Bogardus, he mentioned Frankfurt-style cases, but I don't know that you got into it. So
these have come up actually in several of my discussions
nice.
relevant to the problem of evil, specifically the one with John Peckham, who wrote a book on it's almost like a fall theodicy, an angelic fall but Frankfurt style cases come up in that conversation.
Okay.
So I love these, and go ahead, give it.
Okay, so the classic one, well, the one that people talk about, it's easy to think of like making a decision to either vote for candidate A or vote for candidate B. I won't give names, even though people have fun giving names depending on the year for the upcoming election. But suppose that you're deciding between, or you're deliberating about whether to vote for candidate A or candidate B, and at some time T, you're going to make the decision either in favor of A or B. And suppose that this other person that you don't know, we'll call this person a nefarious neuroscientist. This neuroscientist really wants you to vote for candidate A and not for candidate B. And so what this neuroscientist does is secretly, while you're asleep and without your knowledge, implants this device in your brain that lets the neuroscientist monitor what's going on in your deliberative process. And if it, as it comes close to the time where you're going to make the decision, if it looks like you're going to vote for candidate B, right, the neuroscientist is going to press a button that's going to activate the device and force you to vote for candidate A at that time. Mm-hmm. But as it turns out, you don't find out about this device in your brain. It doesn't actually do anything to your deliberative process. It's just, kind of in the background, but it's not doing anything. And you decide to vote for candidate A, and you do vote for candidate A. So this is a case where, because of the presence of this neuroscientist device, it looks like you were not free to vote, to decide to vote for candidate B. All you could do was decide to vote for candidate A. Mm-hmm. And yet, because that neuroscientist was a mere counterfactual intervener, he didn't actually intervene. He just would have if you were going to vote for candidate B, right? It looks like you're totally morally responsible. You were free in some sense in voting for candidate A. You were the source of that action, even though you didn't have leeway with respect to it.
Yeah. So maybe I think the viewers will get it anyway. But essentially, this mad scientist, if he presses the button, then you vote for candidate A.
Right.
But if he never pressed the button, and you voted for candidate A, you were the source of that that vote. But if he presses the button, then he's the source. So it's all about who's the source of the act. Right.
Yeah. So if someone coerces you into doing something, or God forbid that there is a nefarious neuroscientist out there programming people to do certain actions, right? Even semi-compatibilists would want to say, well, when you're forced to do something like that, you're not the source of the action. There's something problematic there. But if this intervener is merely counterfactual, this counterfactual intervener can take away your alternative possibilities, and yet you can still be morally responsible for acting in the way that you did, even though you lacked alternative possibilities. So a lot of people have found it intuitive that in order for us to be morally responsible, we have to have the ability to do otherwise than what we do, right? If you don't have alternatives, it seems like you get off the hook. This is sometimes called the principle of alternative possibilities.
So I think it was Tim in the comments asked, what is the PAP? So it's the principle of alternative possibilities. That's right. And you mentioned something we were having a discussion before today, it was a few days ago, that really the PAP pertains to moral responsibility. I mentioned like candy bars, but you were saying typically the way philosophers now, like the kind of contemporary thought, is that this is something that we apply to moral decisions. Yeah. I mean,
so some of us think that you can be morally responsible for these sort of neutral acts, like deciding whether to have one candy bar or the other. But yeah, the really interesting ones are where there's something riding on your decision. It matters morally. So maybe voting is like that. Maybe deciding whether to do the moral thing or the sort of thing in your self-interest. But those kinds of cases, it seems to a lot of people like you have to have alternative possibilities to be morally responsible. So the freedom required for moral responsibility is leeway freedom. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
But semi-compatibilists think a Frankfurt style case, like the voting case I just gave, is a counterexample to that principle, because here we have someone who's apparently morally responsible for what they do, but that person lacks alternative possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So if that works, and I hope it does, if that works, then we don't need to have the freedom to do otherwise, or we don't really need to have a choice about, in the sense of the original argument, we don't need to have a choice about what we do in that sense in order for us to be free, morally responsible with respect to those things. So certainly we still make choices, and so we have a choice about what we do in that sense. But this idea of having a choice about that requires leeway, that's not required for freedom and moral responsibility. So semi-compatibilists can say, yeah, maybe none of these other solutions work, maybe they have their problems, but even if the argument is sound, right, that doesn't take away the freedom that we care about, or at least our moral responsibility.
Yeah, okay. Now, you did make a note of a kind of objection to semi-compatibilism, so walk us through that.
Yeah, I got to be fair, and even though I like this view, I have to say it has its problems. So probably the main reason that theists, or Christians in particular, aren't going to like this solution is sort of has the opposite problem as open theism does, whereas open theism sort of takes away a lot of providential control of God's. Semi-compatibilism gives as much as it can in terms of providential control to God. And so now we have this sort of a version of the problem of evil. It looks like God could have made a world where everyone was just determined to always act rightly. If, we don't need to have the freedom to do otherwise in order to be free and morally responsible, well, then God could just make a world where there's no, at least moral evil, right? Maybe there's no evil whatsoever. So why didn't he do that, right? That's semi-compatibilists have to say something different about the problem of evil than the traditional free will defense, which says God really cares about us having a significant incompatibilist in another sense, libertarian free will. So we don't need to get into stuff about determinism in more detail, but that is the worry that, well, why didn't God make a deterministic, better world than this world?
Yeah. All right.
There are other challenges for semi-compatibilists too, but that's the one that I think probably theists would have.
Maybe if somebody, since we're a little short on time, it's 1:22. I don't know. What do you think? If you could run us through that in, 2-3 minutes, and then we start wrapping up.
Yeah, just a summary of what we've done. Is that what you mean? Or
yeah, let's go ahead and start doing a kind of summary.
Okay. Yeah, if people want to talk more about semi-compatibilism, that's fine with me. But
let me make a note of this before you sum up. So if you have a question for Dr. Cyr, please go ahead and type it in the live chat. The live chat's been super active. It's been going the whole time. I like what Andrew Moon said. I saw somewhere. He said, I don't know how you all are typing and talking so much while he's presenting. And Andrew said, I'm going to have to leave the live chat and just pay attention. And that's what I do most of the time. I just can't listen to you and do the live chat. So I, for the most part, just leave the live chat out and listen. But please go ahead and start typing your question now. And I'm going to start looking at the live chat now while Dr. Cyr's summing up.
Yeah. Okay, so I know that things have gotten complicated, especially as we've gotten into all the different responses. So it's good to zoom out and remember the puzzle we're talking about is pretty simple. It's sort of, there's two things in tension: God knowing infallibly what we'll do in advance, and then our having the freedom to refrain from doing what we actually do. So divine foreknowledge and human free will, title of the video, right? So how could it be that that we could be free to do otherwise if that would require God to have a different belief in the past? And that's what the various different responses to the argument have tried to say. So the compatibilist responses, as we've seen, they all try to deny the first premise of the argument. They try to say we do have a choice about what God believed even 1,000 years ago. Well, I should say the timelessness response says, well, God's outside of time. That's what gets us out of the problem. The other two, Ockhamism and the dependence response, they'll say we have a choice about certain parts of the past, right? Either the soft facts about the past if you're an Ockhamist, or the dependent past if you're a dependence theorist. But in any case, we have to get clear on what we mean by the fixity of the past. The timelessness response can say that the past is fixed, but the timeless realm is not fixed, that it isn't in our power to do otherwise than what God knows what we'll do from the timeless realm. And then, these other two responses, Ockamism and the dependence response, they'll say they're either soft facts about the past or dependent facts, like God's beliefs, his believing that we'll do something. These are things that don't constrain our freedom. And we talked about challenges for each of these views along the way. The two incompatibilist responses we talked about, open theism and semi-compatibilism, are really fine with saying that the argument works. It shows that if God did have comprehensive foreknowledge of what we'll do, then we lack the freedom to do otherwise. The open theist says, and so God doesn't have comprehensive foreknowledge. And then the semi-compatibilist says, well, we don't have free will in the sense of leeway or alternative possibilities. We could still have freedom in the sourcehood sense, even if we are not free to do otherwise. And that's what matters for moral responsibility on that view. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but whether you find one view more attractive than another might depend on where you're coming from. It might depend on your views on the philosophy of time, the nature of God. It might depend on your theological commitments. And I think that's fine. You should sort of give a holistic assessment of the different options and kind of take them based on how they comport with the rest of your view, your sort of whole world view.
Yeah. Okay. And I think you're right. All those areas are going to have an impact on, and especially what you give priority to, is going to have an impact on where you might land. But I really appreciate you laying out all those views. I learned a lot just from listening to you. And so it's funny, side comment before we look at the questions. Andrew Moon, when he first messaged me, he said, "Hey, Dr. Cyr is really good on this topic. You might consider having him on." And he said he looks like Clark Kent, and I realized that I might look like a young Lex Luthor. So you've gotten a little crash course in philosophy from Clark Kent and Lex Luthor.
That's right. We'll duke it out afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start looking at the questions that came in. So, I may work my way backwards. So I'll put these on the screen. I'll read these to you, Dr. Cyr.
Okay.
But the viewers can see the question pop up on the screen. So, Andrew Moon said, ask Dr. Cyr this. Does God have the ability to do otherwise? Does God have... I don't know if I would say the pap. I guess the pap in that more general sense, but you could apply it in moral responsibility.
Right. Yeah, that's a tricky and good question that Andrew and I were talking about the other day. So that's great that you brought it up now, Andrew, because I still haven't made up my mind what I want to say in response. I think traditionally people have wanted to say that God does have the freedom to do otherwise. So, yeah, at least with respect to deciding whether to create any world at all versus creating this world, right? There's a lot of, at least Christians have wanted to say God wasn't sort of bound to create us. He was free not to create. Right. There's a sort of sufficiency to the Trinity or something so that God's not dependent on the world in any way. It's not like God had to make us in order to be good or loving or, powerful or anything like that. So I think I want to capture that idea that God was at least free not to create. But how exactly to do that, whether to say, sort of consistent with God's nature, there were these two alternatives, creating this world, creating no world at all. Well, there are certain puzzles about incompatibilist views of free will that I think might be a problem for thinking of God as having that kind of freedom. So an alternative, and I was mentioning this to Andrew, I think I'm attracted to this, is to say, well, there's nothing about there's nothing external to God or his nature that makes him or forces him to create us. It's just that God, given God's nature and given what he cares about, given his reasons, this all might be some metaphorical language anyway, but given all these things about God, it might be that this is sort of the best course of action. Maybe it's, I mean, certainly there have been people like Leibniz and others who have wanted to say that, yeah, God's going to do what's most rational, is he's going to create the best possible world. Maybe there's no best possible world, but in any case, maybe creating one of these really good worlds is rational, and so God did it. I don't know. So I have to think more about this. Andrew's pressing on this, so that's good. And I'm not sure where I want to come down on this exactly.
I just got an email today that's somewhat relevant to this question, and that is not an email from a viewer, but I'd asked a philosopher to come on to speak on this particular topic as it applies to the problem of evil. I believe his name is Paul Little, but I could be wrong. He's one of the editors for Philosophia Christi. Forgot where he's a professor at, but he wrote a paper on this topic of God having the ability to do otherwise, and how that relates to the problem of evil. Because typically I'll just say a few words about this. Typically the kind of free will response says, well, look, God gave us freedom, but that freedom comes with this risk that we'll misuse it. We can use our freedom to do good, or we can use our freedom to do evil. And so we have this kind of, our freedom necessitates this like choice of these alternatives.
Right.
And so that seems good on the face of it, but a potential objection would be, well, wait a minute. Why couldn't God create a creature that has the same type of freedom he has? Because presumably God has freedom, and God never, it's not even, well, it depends on how you want to cash out scripture when it's like, it's impossible for God to lie, and it's so forth. It depends on how you want to interpret those passages. But if you just take them at their face value, it seems like it's not even a possibility, and yet he's free. And so how do you, why can't God create a creature that has the same kind of freedom he has? And so I believe his name's Paul Little, but he wrote a paper on this, and I find that objection fascinating for free will defenses. It seems like there needs to be some kind of answer there, and so hopefully that just whets your appetite. I'm trying to set up a date for that, but it does I think pertain to, can God do otherwise? Because at least when it comes to moral stuff, we want to say probably. But I realize not everyone will say this, but you might want to say no, he can't. That seems to be what the Bible teaches. Some people I've talked to say it actually makes God more glorious if he could do otherwise. He could choose a bad action, but he chooses never to do that. It's like he's even more virtuous, or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, more questions.
If he sort of couldn't help but do the right thing, he might seem less praiseworthy for doing it.
Yeah.
I can see that. Yeah. There's enough puzzles about human freedom that I've got enough on my plate that Andrew's question, I mean, it's gripping to me, and I should figure out what I think about it. But that's the reason that I don't have a fully worked out view on it. I'm still working on my own freedom.
Okay, so let's see. The next one. I'm gonna back up. Oh, Andrew Moon also mentioned that your teacher, John Fisher, is in the chat, and everyone, it was amazing during the live stream. So many people were like, wait a minute, is this the John Fisher that's in this live chat? And so thank you, Dr. Fisher, for watching. And,
indeed, John. Yeah.
Okay, so actually, Dr. Fisher, I answered one of those questions. So it was about guidance control, but he already explained what that was. Phil with Skill, I'm not sure if this is a question to me or Dr. Cyr. He said, please explain why you prefer semi-compatibilism to source libertarianism. I'm pretty sure he's asking you, not me.
I left source incompatibilism or source libertarianism out of. There's just only so many views we could talk about. There is an alternative here, and it might help to solve the puzzle that I did raise about why God couldn't just determine everyone to always act rightly and so solve at least that moral problem of evil. There is this view that PAP is false. We don't need alternative possibilities to be morally responsible. And yet, if we were determined, then we would still lack moral responsibility. So this is an incompatibilist view about causal determinism and free will, moral responsibility, but it gives up the garden of forking paths, leeway, conception of freedom. So it has some in common with the other, the views that we were talking about that want to maintain that kind of freedom to do otherwise, but it has something in common with the semi-compatibilist too. So actually in that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article that I mentioned by Zagzebski, there's a brief section on this. I think it's called the Augustinian, it might be Frankfurtian even, named after Harry Frankfurt and Augustine. Some people treat Augustine, at least some part of his views, as being like this. I'm not convinced that the sourcehood libertarian view is kind of fully sustainable. I think there are problems. I think there are problems for all versions of libertarianism. So libertarianism is the view that we have free will and yet it's incompatible with causal determinism. So I'm a compatibilist in at least the sense that I think we have the freedom required for moral responsibility. But so I'm not a libertarian. And so I guess it would take us too far afield to go into objections to libertarianism. There are big challenges, the problem of luck, the problem of enhanced control. So if you're gripped by those, you're going to have you're going to be wary of libertarian views. There are also theological considerations about providence that go into the mix here. And then finally, I'll say one more thing, since Dr. Fisher has been in the chat. One of the arguments that he gives for preferring compatibilism to any even sourcehood views that are libertarian is that, look, for all we know, the world that we inhabit is causally deterministic. Right? What would you do if tomorrow you woke up and the scientists had discovered that our world is causally deterministic? Right? Would you give up your view that you have freedom or that you're accountable for what you do? I mean, you could be a skeptic. You could become a skeptic. Probably you wouldn't. You'd think, I guess I was wrong about what's required for moral responsibility. So there's this kind of resiliency factor. Our view of ourselves as morally responsible agents should be resilient to the deliverances of the sciences. Even if we found out that our world is deterministic, you might think we're still morally responsible. So there's something to be said for the compatibilist version of the sourcehood view. That's where I land on it.
Okay. We'll try to go through these quickly. This one was interesting. You already, with Andrew's question about God's freedom, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. And it's by Tim. He said, if God knows everything he is going to be doing for the rest of eternity, is God free? So it's like the same. If God knows 1,000 years ago that he will do such and such in the future, then is he free to do that? So it just takes the human freedom out of it and puts God's in.
Yeah, that's a good kind of parallel puzzle for God's freedom. I guess I'll say really quickly, I'd have to think more about this, and it's worth thinking more about. One thing to say is if you think God's outside of time, then really you're going to think that God's actions, if we want to use plural, everything that God does is really the result of God's single activity, right, from this timeless realm. It's not like God does one thing and then he does something else, right? He's going to be, well, I think at least classical theists will accept the doctrine of simplicity. They're going to say God doesn't have parts, including metaphysical parts. And so you can't really distinguish between different acts or things that God will do. So it's not like he knows that he's going to do something else in the future and that constrains him or makes him unfree in the future. You might still worry about his freedom if he's outside of time, but in any case, that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is, for those who have thought that God's in time, whether they're Ockhamists or Molinists, whether they just think God simply knows what's going to happen in the future, or he also knows these counterfactuals of freedom. Everyone that has this kind of view of God thinks there's a kind of structure to the mind of God where there's this, it might not happen in time, probably shouldn't be thought of as happening in time, but there's this kind of priority given to God's decision about what's going to happen. and then what happens comes after that in this sense of priority. So God could sort of plan that he's going to do one thing after another before time begins. And so, yeah, once time gets going, maybe you might want to say he's no longer free, but that's not to take away his freedom if he's sort of planned all of this from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that satisfies your commenter there, but I think that's something to say.
Yeah, that particular response is interesting as it pertains to some Molinist kind of logical priority, and also, well, I won't get into all that. I want to ask other people's questions. Okay, then Bob Kelly said, this was about Molinism, can you explain how on Molinism, God knows what you will do in circumstance C, where C allows for multiple possibilities, even when everything in and up to C is exactly similar?
That's a good question. I'm not going to be the best person to ask Molinism here, because I think this is where Molinism runs into some problems. But I think the most plausible thing to say, and quickly, since we're running out of time, thankfully, I don't have to give a full defense of Molinism. There's going to be certain facts about what creatures would do. And Jordan, you can correct me. You might know more about Molinism than me.
I doubt
there's
it.
Going to be there's going to be certain facts that about what creatures would freely do that God knows, and there's just not going to be any grounds or further explanation for those facts. So some people have raised this as an objection. It's sometimes called the grounding objection. What's going to ground the truth of these counterfactuals of freedom? Right? They're other than the actual world, these are all counterfactual scenarios, and yet we're talking about what creatures would freely do in them, and there's nothing about the circumstances that guarantees that the person will do the thing in question, right? We're supposed to leave open leeway freedom, libertarian freedom. So I think it's just going to be brute, lacking a further explanation.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there.
Okay.
So if you're good to do like 4 more minutes, however many we can fit in about 4 minutes. I want to try and wrap it up we've been going an hour and 41 minutes. So by an hour and 45, I want to stop. Okay. Andrew Moon, this was a good question. Andrew's always full of good questions. He says, or asks, since Dr. Cyr likes eternalism, you might wonder why not presentism. Doesn't that view lead to a weird view of persons? And he notes that this is one of William Lane Craig's objections.
So we should say what presentism is. So I mentioned eternalism is just this. Actually, I don't think I fully said what eternalism was. I might have not fully told it out in the context that I brought it up in. But eternalism says the past, the present, the future, they're all equally real. So there's an easy way of explaining why there are truths about the future on the eternalist view, whereas on the presentist view, only the present is real. So only presently existing objects exist. Presentists will want to say that, typically they'll want to say there are facts about what did happen, about what was the case. Some will want to say there are truths about the future, what will happen. But at the very least, future events, objects, times, don't exist now. Only the presently existing things exist. And so that's going to leave room for an open future, as some presentists want. We mentioned this in connection with open theism. Okay, so Andrew asked about persons. If you're an eternalist, you might think you get a different view of persons than if you were a presentist. I'm not sure which views of persons Andrew has in mind. I guess 2 views about persistence in general, not about persons in particular, that sort of tend to map onto presentism versus eternalism. This is going to get us into some more jargon, but the 2 views are endurantism. Objects exist over time by enduring through time, and what that means is they are wholly present at each time that they exist. And then the rival view is what's sometimes called perdurantism. I didn't make up the terminology, but objects perdure in the sense that they have temporal parts at various times, and so the whole object is extended through time, and it persists through time by virtue of having temporal parts at various times. So there's an analogy to space here, extended through space by virtue of having a part here, and so on. I'm not wholly present at any point in space. So too, the presentists will say I'm not wholly present at any point in time, but I'm there because I have a part there, a temporal part at all the times that I exist. So maybe Andrew thinks there's something wrong with presentism. That would take us pretty far afield here in our last minute or so. But it's good that he brought that up, because this is exactly what you should take into mind when you're evaluating views about foreknowledge and freedom. Does this commit me to a view in the philosophy of time? Does that commit me to further things about the nature of objects and persons and so on? So it's worth taking that into account. I guess I might be okay with presentism or other views of persons that my eternalism implies, if it does imply them. So yeah, I guess if that's a bullet to bite, then it's not so bad to me.
Okay. Final one, and you can answer this very quickly because we're at the hour and 45-minute mark. Slam RN asked, so would Dr. Cyr say if he is reformed?
Yeah, so if you take the view of providence that I've sort of said is compatible with moral responsibility on the semi-compatibilist view, then you could have a reformed view in the sense, even you could say a Calvinistic view, where it's compatible with God's determining everything that happens, that we're free, at least in the sense required for moral responsibility. So if you are not reformed in that sense, or you're not comfortable with theological determinism, then you might not like the semi-compatibilist view. I don't know that you have to be reformed if you're a semi-compatibilist, but it is a good way of capturing the form. I should say there are other compatibilist views, even about divine foreknowledge and freedom, that other reformed folk like Jonathan Edwards have defended, where leeway freedom to do otherwise, what matters in terms of the ability to do otherwise, is compatible with being determined and with God's foreknowledge. So the semi-compatibilist wants to sort of agree more with incompatibilists than the traditional compatibilists do. So there's sort of room for debate even within these theological categories, like Reformed views or Calvinistic views. There's room for a sort of in-house debate among them.
All right. Well, I will wrap it up there. Just hang around for 1 minute, Dr. Cyr, please.
Okay.
For those that stuck with me the entire time, thank you very much. I really think if you listened tonight, you learned a lot, and I know I did. So I appreciate Dr. Cyr coming on, and maybe we can have him back to discuss time travel. That's a topic that really interests me and seems to interest him. So we'll see.
I would be happy to. Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick reminder that I have an interview next week. I believe it's on Monday with Dr. William Lane Craig, and we'll be discussing his view of the incarnation. He'll be defending this option called neo-Apollinarianism. And if you're like, what is that? You're going to want to listen. Honestly, until I read his chapter, I didn't realize how difficult it was to reconcile the claims that Jesus is fully God and Jesus is fully man. Those turn out to be really hard to put together. So you'll want to listen to that. If you like the content of this channel, if you like the content of this video, please click the like button and click subscribe and turn on the little bell. It helps my channel grow. And then and I would ask you to prayerfully consider this, supporting me on Patreon. If I am able to gain some more financial support, then I'll actually have more time, especially during the summer right now, to be making videos. So that would really help a lot. You can just go to patreon.com/cc apologetics. Yeah. All right. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you soon.